Yes, sir. Well, Jack, thank you very much. I could not agree more emphatically. Barack Obama is the most lawless president this country has ever seen. You know, I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with a liberal constitutional law professor named Jonathan Turley, Professor Turley testified before Congress. Now, Turley voted for Obama. And what Professor Turley has said is Barack Obama has become the embodiment of the imperial presidency. Barack Obama is the president Richard Nixon always wished he could be. The danger is enormous. You're exactly right. We need to stand up against the lawlessness and defend the Constitution. And let me take a minute to talk about the Iran letter and the reaction to that, because that is, I think, very relevant. So 47 of us signed in the Senate a letter to Iran informing Iran how our basic Constitution operates. And that letter said very simply, under our Constitution, for anything to be binding law in the United States of America, it must either be a treaty submitted to the Senate and ratified by 2/3 of the Senate, or a law passed by Congress and signed into law by the President. That Barack Obama cannot sit down with Supreme Leader Khamenei, negotiate a deal that undermines American national security, negotiate a deal that paves the way for Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon, and have that be binding on the United States of America. Now, you know, the hysteria from the White House and Democrats in response to that letter reveals a lot. As Shakespeare put it, methinks she doth protest too much. Now listen, we shouldn't have to write a letter. How many of you, okay, a bunch of y'all, there are a bunch of people in 7th and 8th grade. Where is some of the 7th and 8th graders who were here? All right. You guys in school, they teach you basic civics, that a treaty has to go to the Senate to be ratified. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, the President doesn't have the understanding of the Constitution demonstrated by this young 8th grader. The reason that letter was necessary is because this President's saying over and over again it's his intention not to submit the treaty to the Senate, not to submit the law to the Congress, but rather to try to unilaterally decree it. No president of the United States has any authority to make law in this country. It has to be pursuant to the Constitution. And Jack, your point about the United Nations, in response, the Obama White House is saying they want to go to the United Nations to end-run the Congress, end-run federal law, and end-run the Constitution. Well, I'll tell you, before I was in the Senate, I was the Solicitor General of Texas, the chief lawyer for the state in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. The biggest fight we fought was a case called Medellin versus Texas. I would encourage you to look it up. In that case, Texas stood against the United Nations, the World Court, 90 foreign nations, and the President of the United States. The central question in that case was twofold. And I'm going to take just a minute to tell you about that case because it's highly relevant to the UN issue here. The case began with a horrible crime of 2 teenage girls that were murdered in Houston. But in that case, the World Court, the judicial arm of the United Nations, issued an order to the U.S. to reopen the convictions of 51 murderers across this country. First time in history a foreign court's tried to bind the U.S. justice system. I argued the case twice in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. In addition to the World Court and the UN on the other side, the president who opposed us, I'm very sorry to say, was George W. Bush. And President Bush signed a 2-paragraph order that attempted to order the state courts to obey the World Court. Now listen, I sat down with the Attorney General at the time, and it was an unusual thing for the state of Texas to be litigating against the President of the United States, who was a Texan, who was the former governor of Texas, who was a Republican and a friend. And yet I'm proud to say I went in front of the Supreme Court on behalf of the state of Texas and said, no president, whether Democrat or Republican, has the authority to give away U.S. sovereignty. And Texas won by a vote of 6-3. The Supreme Court said, the president cannot give away our sovereignty, and the United Nations has no authority to bind the United States of America. All right. Yes, ma'am. I'm getting the hook, so this is our last question.
GrokTV.